It's a privilege today to be speaking with Dr. Dustin Crummett. Dustin is a philosopher who specializes on applied ethics. He's also very involved in effective altruist organizations. Dustin, could you say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a philosopher. My PhD is from Notre Dame. I was a postdoc in Munich for 2 years at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Now I am an affiliate instructor at the University of Washington, Tacoma, on the west coast of the U.S., a little south of Seattle. And I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called the Insect Institute.
Okay, I thought we'd just launch straight in. We're talking today about the ethics of abortion and abortion politics. So first question, Dustin, why aren't you pro-life?
Yeah, so I do think it's like there are a complicated series of philosophical questions involved here, right? Unlike a lot of people in popular discourse who, anyway, yeah, I guess a couple things that seem to me to be problematic for the pro-life position. One is personal ontology, right? So I take it usually the way that the pro-life argument is going to go is you're going to try to argue that I began to exist at conception, right? And then either the claim will be personhood, full moral status, whatever is essential to me, and so I had full moral status at conception, or the future like ours argument. Well, whatever my moral status was, I had a valuable future, and it's wrong to deprive an individual of a valuable future, right? Why think that I began to exist at conception? Usually the argument is, well, a human organism begins to exist at conception. And that's true, or maybe it begins to exist shortly after. You know, there's a little dispute about that. But I don't think it's really very plausible that I am a human organism. It seems to me that I am my mind, and I'm somehow related to a human organism, right?
Why?
Well, one of the canonical arguments for this position that I think convinces most philosophers who think about this actually is imagining what happens if my mind and this organism part ways. So suppose you cut out my cerebrum, which probably is the part of my brain that's responsible for consciousness, memory, personality, etc. Maybe you leave the lower part intact, which regulates vital functions. You cut out my cerebrum, you place it into a new body, keeping my consciousness, memory, etc., first-person perspective, whatever, intact. You could even imagine that you keep it electrically stimulated. So I'm sitting here conscious the whole time, right? I'm wondering, oh, when are they going to put me in the new body? You know, I can't see anything. It looks like I'm in the new body now, right? It looks like I go with my mind in that scenario. But it looks like my organism doesn't go with my mind. The organism is still there on the table. It's still alive. The heart's still beating. It's brain dead now. Or, I mean, it's experiencing higher brain death, so it's in a comatose state. But it doesn't look like it goes with the cerebrum, which is just one part of one organ. The organism's still there. So if I go with my mind rather than my organism, it looks like I must be either my mind or something else that goes with my mind and not my organism. I can't part ways with myself. So that's one reason. There are other arguments that are sometimes more complicated. Yeah. One that's not too complicated is thinking about cases of so some cases of conjoined twins, you might think the right diagnosis is that there are two minds but only one organism. It's kind of biologically complicated, but you at least can imagine a case where you have two minds in one organism. In Star Wars Episode 1, there's this alien that has two heads. Or like Cerberus, the three-headed dog. You know, presumably there are like three minds. It seems like if you have two distinct minds. They're maybe having a conversation with each other or something, but they're part of one organism. Seems like you have two people there, right?
Yeah.
But just one organism, and so those people at least can't be the organism. And then the natural thought is, oh, okay, people in general are their minds or something like that, rather than their organisms. That, like I say, there are some other arguments, maybe having to do with mereology, whatever. But if you think that, then the natural thing to think is going to be, okay, so when does one of us begin to exist? It's going to be when the mind begins to exist, rather than when the organism begins to exist. It wouldn't follow that like the organism before that point has no value or whatever. I mean, but it would follow that there's not a person there, there's not one of us, there's not a being that has a future like ours, because that being hasn't come into existence yet. So at least abortion before that point, it looks like the pro-life view is not so plausible. You also, I mean, of course, bodily autonomy arguments, going back to Judith Jarvis Thomson, very influential, much discussed. It is quite, I think it's very complicated trying to evaluate, can you really, I mean, Thompson's claim is that even if you grant that the fetus is a person just like me, abortion, is fine. I think it's complicated whether you can actually, but surely at least the woman's interests matter somehow, right? Surely those affect things in some way. And I think, I think everybody kind of really, really gets that to some extent. Similarly, one thing that's interesting that I think we're going to talk about later is that pro-life philosophers often will grant, in response to a particular objection, that the death of a fetus is not nearly as bad as the death of a born child. And that might be relevant to the ethics of abortion too. So I think, again, I think it is a complicated question. I don't say that it's trivial. I don't say that it's an easy decision, whatever. But yeah, the kind of hardline pro-life view, this is just straight up murder. I don't think that that's so plausible, and I definitely, really I don't think that's plausible at all, but it especially, I think, is not plausible when you're talking about early abortions before a mind has developed. So I had a debate that's on YouTube with Trent Horn where I kind of laid out some of these arguments, at greater length. But
so suppose you're right that the embryo isn't numerically identical to you and it's not a person yet. You granted that maybe it still has some kind of value, maybe in the way that the Grand Canyon or a Great Red Oak has some kind of value. Maybe the particular kind of value it has is a symbolic value to do with the fact that it's a human body. Maybe we shouldn't desecrate a human corpse. And in the same way, maybe there are some moral constraints on how we treat human embryos, even if they're not persons yet. Do you think that's true? And if it is true, would it have any bearing on whether abortions are permissible in most cases?
Yeah, I think there's, so that's a position that's defended by Ronald Dworkin, by, someone whose name I forget, Kitts? Someone at Georgetown.
No, there's someone with the surname Kitts, maybe Megan Kitts, I'm not sure.
No. Someone who I'll look up her name and you can put it in the video description or one of those pop-ups that it does seem the argument that the person who's not, I flew here from Seattle and there's a 9-hour time difference, and so the argument that the person whose name I'm blanking on makes is like, yeah, it doesn't seem like it would be okay to, dissect an embryo in science class or tack them up as wall art. So clearly there is some significance that makes it not just, like a tooth that's fallen out or something, right? There's some plausibility to that. I guess maybe it will depend on the case. You might still think, well, in most abortions, the interests of the woman are going to be enough to justify transgressing that sort of intrinsic impersonal value or whatever, even though it would mean that you shouldn't do it just for fun or but.
Yeah, and so there's the case in Trent Horn's book. You mentioned that you debated Trent, where I don't know if it's true or not, but apparently a student had a number of abortions to use the dead fetuses as part of an art project. So maybe an abortion would be wrong in that case, but for the actual reasons that people get abortions, it seems like.
Yeah, it seems like there are other art projects you could do. I mean, probably wouldn't be that much worse as art.
What do you make of the thought that there's a lot of debate about abortion? It's kind of unclear who's right, given that there are smart, well-informed people on both sides.
Yeah.
And so we should maybe, people should refrain from having or performing abortions just out of the moral risk that maybe they're killing a person, in the same way that you'd have to be really sure that nobody was in the woods before you shot into it at random. You should be very, very careful in checking that abortion is permissible before you have or perform one.
Yeah. I think, in general, the idea that if there's just some chance that something is seriously wrong, that's at least some reason not to do it. That seems right.
Yeah.
Then you have to think about how likely is it and what are the reasons for doing the thing, right? I guess, again, it might depend on the circumstances, but in a case where there are strong reasons at stake, and if you think that the pro-life view is really quite unlikely to be correct, particularly when you're talking about a very early abortion, you might think it's kind of justified to take the risk. I also think, maybe this isn't exactly an argument, but people are a little bit selective in terms of how they employ moral risk reasoning. I think sometimes people really like using it against the other side, but then not, I think there are much more plausible arguments that, say, failing to donate to charities that could save the lives of people in developing nations, that is very similar to murder, and yet people don't often take that as a reason to give away all their money, or moral risk arguments against eating factory farmed animal products. There are lots of areas where people who use the moral risk reasoning in the abortion case don't, to my mind, act in the way that they should with regard to some other cases. That doesn't mean that it's wrong in the abortion case. Now, maybe all these moral risk arguments are good. Maybe we should just not do very much. I don't know. Yeah, but I think it's just important to not be selective in thinking. Yeah, if there's just some tiny chance that this is seriously wrong, because it can be a little bit easy to get mileage out of that when you want to, and then ignore it the rest of the time. We need to really think about, are we being consistent? How plausible is it to think that a tiny chance is enough to render something wrong, even in the existence of, even in the presence of strong countervailing reasons, etc.
What is the impairment argument against abortion, and where do you take issue with it?
So the impairment argument against abortion, that was developed by Perry Hendricks. I guess the argument is something like, look, it's wrong. We agree that it's wrong to seriously impair a fetus that is going to be born. So we agree that you shouldn't drink really heavily during pregnancy, knowing that you're going to inflict fetal alcohol syndrome on your future child, right? And then the thought is, okay, so it's wrong to inflict this serious impairment. Well, if it's wrong to inflict an impairment of such and such a degree, then it looks like it'll also be wrong to inflict an even more serious impairment. What could be a more serious impairment than death? If you're dead, you can't do anything, right? And so it follows, or at least it's supposed to follow, so killing the fetus has to be wrong because that's an even greater impairment than inflicting fetal alcohol syndrome. I think that there are a couple problems with that argument. I think the most, maybe one of the clearest ones is, in the case of fetal alcohol syndrome, we agree that like the future child, that's going to be a person that exists who you have harmed for morally insufficient reasons. You've seriously harmed for morally insufficient reasons. If it's the case that many or most abortions occur before the person begins to exist, then there isn't a person that you've harmed, right? You prevented someone from coming into existence, but of course you can do that by using a condom or just not having sex or whatever, right? And so one asymmetry is if what I was saying earlier is correct about personal ontology, then an early abortion, there is no victim because the person doesn't exist yet. Whereas inflicting fetal alcohol syndrome, there is a victim. There's someone in the future who exists who. It seems to me that that is sufficient to diffuse the argument in most cases. I think that there are some further disanalogies that I've written about a bit. But Perry, of course, has responses to that line of reasoning, but I've never been convinced by them.
So now moving on, I'm wondering, suppose we just assume that everything you've said is false and the pro-life position is true. If we come to know that the pro-life position is true, how should we behave politically? I'm thinking specifically about how we should vote. Many pro-lifers think that if the pro-life position is true, it's obviously the case that we should always vote for pro-life candidates when the other candidate is pro-choice. And that abortion, just given the number of deaths, is going to immediately outweigh and swamp every other issue, healthcare, gun control, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So do you think that's true? Do you think pro-lifers should be single-issue voters?
Yeah, I don't. So I wrote a paper on this very issue, in fact. What a coincidence. No, yeah, so this is an argument you hear frequently in American politics. Yeah. There are 800 and some thousand abortions every year in the US. If you agree that abortion is murder, then what other issue could possibly compare, right? Yeah. And so even if the pro-life candidate is attempting to overthrow the government or is non-ideal in other ways, like this has to be prioritized, even if policies will kill people due to inadequate health care, blah, 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 blah. This has to be prioritized just because the scale of the problem is so great. So, there are a couple moves you might make in response to that line of reasoning, right? You might just reject the pro-life view. Okay, well, the conclusion doesn't follow because the antecedent is false. You might try to argue that some other issue is actually of even greater scale. Maybe climate change threatens civilization, will kill many millions of people in the future. Maybe factory farming causes so much suffering. Yeah. Maybe AI risk is so great. There are different candidate other issues. You might, sometimes people will argue, well, maybe the Democrats will actually reduce the abortion rate more in the long run by providing contraception, social services. Yeah, there are different moves that people make. What I do in that paper is I just sort of say, let's grant the pro-life position for purposes of argument. Yeah. And let's assume that those other responses don't work. It still doesn't quite seem clear to me that the single issue voter conclusion goes through. So here's why. There's an argument against the pro-life view that a lot of people maybe will have heard called the embryo rescue case. So the embryo rescue case says, look, there's a fire in the fertility clinic. Yeah. Here is a kid who's trapped, the beam has fallen on them or something. Here's this kid who's trapped. Here is a tray full of a bunch of, recently fertilized eggs. Yeah. You can only save one. which one should you save? And of course, almost everybody thinks you should save the kid,
Yeah.
but ordinarily, all else equal, you should save more people rather than fewer. And so the argument is supposed to be, well, this shows that the recently fertilized eggs are not people, right? Because you realize that one 5-year-old is much more important than 50 recently fertilized eggs or whatever, right? Pro-life philosophers responding to this argument usually will grant that you can save the kid.
Yeah.
They agree with the intuition, or at least they grant that like it's permissible to save the kid, right? And then they'll say, but that's not because the embryos lack full moral status. It's not because they're not people. It's for other reasons.
Yeah.
It's because the kid will be scared and experience pain as he burns. It's because the kid has future-directed desires, dreams about the future that will be foiled if he dies, has relationships with other people. Other people have invested resources into him and have a stake in him now, whatever. There are all these other things that, according to this line of response, make the death of the 5-year-old worse, much worse, than the death of even quite a large number of embryos, even though they're equal in moral status, right?
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be the same as the way that, like, maybe you think you would, you would save the 5-year-old over like 2 people on their deathbeds or whatever, who are going to die tomorrow anyway. It's not because those people are not people or they have less moral status than the kid. It's just their interest in continuing to live is much less because they're going to die soon anyway, right? Their deaths are much less bad. And so the usual pro-life response is to make that move. Say, no, there's a quality of moral status, and that explains why it's wrong to intentionally kill the embryos. But all the same, we grant that the death of the child is much worse, and that's why you should prevent the death of the child. What I argue in the paper is that if you grant that, that similarly looks like it diffuses this scale body count type reasoning for being a single issue pro-life voter. Because the argument for being a single issue pro-life voter, not that this is the only possible one, but it's quite a popular one, and the one we were discussing was, well, look, there are so many more deaths than from pollution or inadequate health care, guns, whatever. There's so many more deaths, and you should save more people rather than fewer, right? You should prevent more deaths, so you should prioritize this issue. But if we agree that the deaths are much, much less bad, if we agree that the deaths of a born person, the death of a born person is worse than the death of many early fetuses, that calls this reasoning into question, right? And so it begins to look like, if we grant the pro-life view, it's not that abortion is no longer significant, but it looks more like one issue among others, as opposed to this issue that is overwhelmingly catastrophic and needs to be prioritized at all other costs.
I mean, some of our pro-life friends who are watching this might be thinking, well, that's true, but we need to focus on the fact that abortion is actively killing the fetus and intentionally so, whereas lots of the other issues where born human lives are being taken, with the exception maybe of war, the lives are not being taken intentionally. We're not dealing with murder. It's rather preventing deaths versus preventing murders, and preventing murders seems more serious, and so maybe that justifies single-issue voting.
Yeah. So I discuss a number of lines of response like that, and my response in each case is, well, suppose we just modified the case. You're right. So suppose someone set a fire intentionally to destroy these embryos, and the 5-year-old actually, this is an unrelated fire that was started by accident. So now you can prevent the intentional killing of a large number of embryos or the accidental death of the 5-year-old. It doesn't seem like that really changes the calculus, right? And so even if you think that your reasons to prevent intentional killings are stronger, which it's not totally obvious that that's true, maybe there is a case for it, but it doesn't seem like it's enough to make it the case that you should prioritize you know, saving even, say, 2 embryos over 1 born person or something, right?
The only published response to your paper, as far as I'm aware, is by Michael DeVito and Tyler McNabb. And they have this thought that the kind of body count reasoning that you're arguing against, that's a sort of active reasoning process where you make an analogy between, say, like a genocide and abortion, and you draw a comparison. But they think, what if you imagine a pro-life reasoner called Tom who sees a live abortion and immediately comes to believe that this is horrific with no reasoning process in the middle, and then they realize that lots of abortions are happening, and with no intermediate reasoning process, they come to think that this needs to be stopped now. Do you think that he could be rational in being a single issue voter if he just immediately comes to believe with no intermediate reasoning that abortion is the biggest issue?
Yeah, it's a little bit, so what I did was I said, here's this argument people often give, and this argument doesn't work. If I'm remembering their response correctly, basically what they say is, yeah, okay, maybe you're right, that argument doesn't work, but what if it's just properly basic?
Could you say what properly basic
Properly
is?
basic is, it's supposed to be just something you can just believe on the basis of immediate intuition or whatever. You don't need to give a further argument for it.
Yeah, you just immediately perceive the axioms of logic, and you don't need to give a further argument for the axioms.
Yeah, and of course the thing is that you could say that for anything, right? I mean, well, what if my position is just properly basic? Okay, if it is, then I guess that's right. I mean, what more is there to say? I guess it could be that I mean, if somebody just intuits that so clearly, it might be hard to argue them out of it. What could I mean, I could try to say things to move them away from that. You know, lots of people, even most pro-life people, if you look at polls, most pro-life people are not single-issue voters.
Yeah.
They don't say that they're single.
I think it's only something like 27%.
Yeah, something like that, around a quarter. So most pro-life people don't have that intuition.
Yeah.
It seems like that intuition potentially clashes with other things. Maybe one lesson of my paper is that it seems like it clashes with our intuition about the embryo rescue case. You could think about, I mean, what exactly are the limits of this? You know, Romania, Ceausescu was an awful dictator, tortured all these people, made the country absolutely miserable. And then he was overthrown, and the country became a democracy, and everything got a lot better. They also legalized abortion. And as a result, there are now more abortions in Romania than there used to be. It seems very counterintuitive to think that really it would have been better if Ceausescu had stuck around. All these people would be getting tortured to death or whatever, but at least abortion would still be illegal. So, like, maybe it's properly basic that's not, that's too much, but like whatever Donald Trump is going to do, that's an acceptable, you know, I mean, I don't know, I guess. I think, I mean, there are like non-crazy epistemological views on which if you believe something, if you just have a really strong intuition, that you're subjectively reasonable in trusting the intuition. But of course, that's just so for anything. So we can talk, and I can try to like move you away from the intuition. Don't you have these other intuitions? What about other people who disagree? You know, I guess that's all there is to say, really. I mean,
I agree. So in theory, it could justify it if it were in fact properly basic. But you could say that about anything. I lost my train of thought.
I mean, it's, I don't think they gave an argument that it is properly basic. It's just, if it is, then it's rational, and that, I mean, that's kind of trivial, I guess. I guess I don't think that it is properly basic, for reasons I've given. Could somebody be subjectively rational if they have, even if it's not really properly basic, if they have the strong intuition, could somebody be subjectively rational? If they have the strong intuition. Maybe so, but only according to accounts on which people could be subjectively rational in holding any view if they have a strong intuition. And so it's not that interesting a conclusion to me. I thought what we were supposed to get is this argument that was supposed to convince all the other pro-life people who aren't single-issue voters that, like, oh, this is why, right? It was supposed to convince people who are pro-choice, oh, well, if you were pro-life, you would see why I'm a single, you know.
So one final issue, a political issue I want to focus on is the issue of anti-abortion violence. So sometimes pro-choicers will claim that if you're pro-life, you're really committed to saying that anti-abortion violence up to assassinating abortion doctors is permissible because it's in defense of human life, and the standard rules of killing in defense of others would apply. It seems like if person A is going to kill person B, it's okay to kill person A in defense of person B if B is innocent. And just given the number of abortions that a standard abortion doctor is going to perform in his or her career, it seems like maybe on the pro-life view it's going to be permissible or even obligatory in some cases for pro-lifers to assassinate abortion providers, or at least maim them, like cut off their hands so that they can't provide abortions anymore. Do you think that's true?
I think that's not true in real-world circumstances. There are very easy stories to tell about why that would be counterproductive from the pro-life point of view, et cetera, et cetera. You should focus on nonviolent action, et cetera. So it's probably not true in reality. But in kind of an idealized case where no one's going to find out, et cetera, et cetera. It does seem like it becomes difficult if you really hold the view that abortion it's just like shooting a 5-year-old in the face. And here's this person who's going to shoot. It becomes, I think, and this is someone else whose name I forget wrote a paper that came out about this a couple years ago.
Jeremy Williams.
Yes, Jeremy Williams. It does seem like it's quite difficult to avoid the conclusion that in principle, it would be okay, maybe not only to assassinate abortion doctors, but to use violence against somebody who's driving a woman to the clinic, maybe non-lethal violence against a pregnant woman or so. Things that really seem awful, right? It does seem like that's some sort of intuitive argument against the very strong pro-life view. Maybe the best thing for the pro-life person to do, in my view, is kind of weaken the view. Okay, I acknowledge that it's not like shooting a 5-year-old in the face. It's still wrong, should be restricted, whatever. But it's still. Jeff McMahon at one point says, we all recognize that abortion is somehow different. You could agree that it's somehow different, but still think that's wrong, right? So I think that's an option that is maybe open to somebody who's pro-life. It does seem to me that there's a real, because even in these idealized cases, it still seems like really bad to use violence. So it does seem like that's some sort of argument against, say, the sort of view that somebody like Trent has.
So if it's being used as an argument against the pro-life position, it seems like it could also be used as an argument against some pro-choice positions. So I take it that you think that personhood begins somewhere during pregnancy, later on when the mind begins to exist. And so someone can put a similar argument to you. They can say a woman is driving to an abortion clinic to have a late-term abortion. Given that it's a person at that stage, it seems like you're committed to saying that it's permissible to use non-lethal violence on the woman or lethal violence on the clinic workers. So how do you personally avoid the reductio? And whatever you say, is that something that a pro-lifer could say just as easily?
So my position on personal ontology entails that there is this very strong reason not to do it at some point, right? That wasn't present before. It doesn't entail that it's equivalent to shooting a 5-year-old in the face, though, right? Because there may be other factors, like some of the other things I mentioned. And so Yeah, it seems like it has to be that those other factors are what explain why it's not okay to use violence in that case, even though it would be okay to use violence against somebody who is about to smother an infant or something.
So like
right?
bodily autonomy, the fact that maybe the fetus's death is less bad than the death of an adult, right?
Yeah. It's got to be some combination of those things. And like I say, a pro-life person could say those things also explain why you shouldn't use violence, and abortion is still wrong. It's it's just that requires giving up on the hardline view that somebody like Trent holds, or so it seems to me.
Yeah. Just as a closing question, this might be a hard one, but do you have any thoughts off the top of your head? Suppose people are convinced by what you say and they become pro-choice. Do you have any advice on how they should proceed politically themselves, how they should do activism, how they should vote?
Oh. Well, I guess, I mean, thinking about the U.S. context,
Yeah.
I mean, I do think the Democrats are like pretty bad, but they're better, to my mind, than the Republicans along a range of axes, including this one. So I guess I think if you're in a competitive state, you should vote against the Republicans. But I guess I think that anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know if that. I don't know if I have a whole lot that's super informative to say beyond that. I do. Yeah, I don't know. A lot of the stuff the Republicans are doing on there are really going to like radicalize me on abortion. Or so. I don't know. I don't like a lot of these laws that have been passed and stuff. But I guess I don't have anything to say that's not sort of trivial and obvious about it.
Okay, it seems like it's a good place to close. Dustin, thank you so much for your time. You've been very generous with it, also with lending me your hotel room to film with it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure.